when you start at the end and you're like, oh my God, how do we understand billions of chips at these tiny microstructures with thousands of layers? You're never going to really understand it. But if you start at the beginning and you be like, oh, this used to just be like this simple NPN gate, and then we just made it way smaller, that is how you can like put it all together.
Semiconductors. How does one learn about the industry? And what's it like making a living off of creating content about it? To discuss, we have on today Doug O'Loughlin of the Fabricated Knowledge Substack, as well as John, who runs the Asianometry YouTube channel and newsletter. Welcome to China Talk YouTube. How and why did you guys get into chips?
Doug, it started with TSMC. I wasn't necessarily interested in technology first. I wanted to learn about the history behind the technologies and how they came to be. And so a lot of actually, some of the videos, they come from a story approach of kind of what we see today, the technologies that we see today, and the various parts of it. What was the kind of the timeline of technology adoption from those industries over time? And for that just made more interest. That was more interesting to me. And it got to the point where if you find 3 or 4 different things, like you learn about TSMC, you hear about UMC, you go like, oh, that's really interesting. And you sort of add that to a list to do later. And then you go into UMC, you see Vanguard Semiconductor, and then you see Z Group, and then you start blows up exponentially. And so, it's difficult, but over time you get to understand it more.
So yeah, Doug, talk about sort of like leveling up knowledge and what was most and least helpful for you on the process.
Well, John has it exactly right in terms of history, I think. I think that's something that made me a lot better at this. And frankly, I was watching some YouTube videos by John. This is like before. I remember when I first started watching his stuff, I was like, wow, this is really well researched and stuff. And I felt like the context of history really makes everything more understandable. I was talking to someone, and this guy is CTO of a semiconductor company. He's like, I don't understand how any of this works if I don't understand how it worked in the beginning and how we got here, because it using that context makes everything a lot easier to understand. Because once upon a time, everything was understandable in a human scale way. Like the first chips at Intel, they were doing on like laptop, they were doing on set-top benches, like they were doing lithography, like everything was visible, like you could understand what a transistor was being printed onto a chip, right? And there was like 35 or maybe 1,000 transistors, and maybe you couldn't see it, but you can understand it. And then fast forward at 30 years, that process is just scaled down infinitely. And so, when you start at the end and you're like, oh my God, how do we understand billions of chips at these tiny microstructures with thousands of layers? You're never going to really understand it. But if you start at the beginning and you be like, oh, this used to just be like this simple NPN gate, and then we just made it way smaller, that is how you can put it all together. And so this applies to everything. Like this applies to packaging. I remember I finally understood testing and packaging after I read a book about Teradyne's history, or mostly testing, not packaging. But almost everything is, if you start in the very beginning, it's actually understandable, and then when you can fast forward it 40 years of progress, and then it doesn't make any sense, but you're like, I kind of understand the basics, and I kind of understand how they shrink it. Now I kind of have an understanding of what's going on today. So that history context is probably one of the most important things. And I think for me, whenever I start a new research project into one of the verticals, I do try to start with stuff that's relevant right now, because to understand why is it important right now. But almost always, I feel like the deeper understanding comes when I start to do the history.
I think the thing for me when I was learning semiconductors is that I started with the history. Right? I learned. I tried to, just to learning almost anything else I did before, was that I try to pick out the things I understand, and I take that and try to expand it, right? There's so much more within a single sentence that I want to learn. Right now, I think when I started out researching lithography, started researching, the sciences behind all these transistors and all these physics and stuff, like there's still so much I don't know, but it's just picking up things over time slowly and advancing and challenging myself as I got more advanced. So you start with like a scientific paper. At first, you might start with like an article or blog post. Then you go to scientific articles, and then you go on to full-blown textbooks. And the more that you start seeing things repeat over and over you get a better understanding. Like right now, I'm doing a video about a complete EUV system, the history of the EUV development. And like half of the terms didn't make sense to me. But over time, as I made more and more videos about this EUV system, which are not popular, like in the end, you finally get to the point where I feel like I kind of understand the whole concept of how this machine works. There's no kind of substitute for time and just brute effort.
So Doug, a little while ago, you tweeted out sort of like your 10 favorite semiconductor books. You put together a little syllabus. You want to sort of highlight 2 or 3 that you think are particularly kind of interesting or useful for folks trying to get up the curve?
Yeah, if we're gonna do just 2, I think 2's the I would do, and so like I would do 1 very core history because it really helps. Makers of the Microchip or Intel Trinity, they're kind of the same. I think Makers of the Microchip is maybe better from a true historical perspective. It's closer to a like a textbook about what exactly happened, and they go pretty in depth in terms of like, hey, this is the first transistor, this is the first, like, this is the patent, like this is like, you know, this is the meeting. Versus Intel Trinity goes over a lot of the same things, but with like a people first approach. And I would say it's not as intense into Fairchild, which really was the 0 to 1 moment, but Intel, which is, I would guess, like the 1 to 100 moment. Intel was the first truly prolific, successful company in the industry. So I think those, either or is pretty good. Honestly, both would be great, but choose one, whatever feels great to you about that. And then the other one I really like is Fabless. Fabless, in my opinion, really like when you read it, it's kind of, I was like, man, how did I not read this earlier? Because everything they talk about is essentially the current state of how things work. It's like an industry overview of the way the world has come to be, and then also the predictions in the last back half of the book. Like almost, there's some, I mean, some of them didn't come true, but like some of them are so obvious and so true. There's like, oh, this advanced packaging thing is going to be a big deal. And like now all we do and care about is advanced packaging. Those 2 books, the one from the history and then one kind of explaining the entire fabless ecosystem, especially, you know, TSMC, the IP companies, the EDA guys, those 2, in my opinion, are like really the 2 foundational texts. And then, you know, if you want to go deeper, I personally, the way I like when I try to do a big dive, I try to find the oldest history textbook I can find about it. Oftentimes they can be really crappy. Like the Teradyne book was good, but maybe not great. You know, a TI book I found really useful actually when I did some work on TI. So just trying to find the most comprehensive history book about the company is always a great way to start. If you're doing like an individual dive.
Yeah, I'll make a pitch for kind of a book that sort of gets you from Fabless to the present. Chris Miller's Chip Wars. So what's the value of talking to people in the industry relative to just reading stuff on the internet?
So I feel about this like 2 ways. On one hand, if we're talking about the day-to-day newsletter, in like the terms of mechanical content making, I find that oftentimes I'm really trying to push things out on a schedule, and I don't let good be the enemy of perfect. And especially from a financial perspective, which is almost everything I write from, I don't really find like, you know, I have a high-level understanding. I can apply like, you know, the high-level understanding, or I guess a medium-level understanding into like how it matters in the economics of these companies and push something out. So if I had to say like my core content, I don't really think it's extremely valuable part of my process. But if we're going to talk about like the deeper technological primers, probably one of the ones that I've done more recently, we'll skip the side time or the timer one, but I think the metrology one. Oh my God, dude. Metrology is freaking hard as hell. I read a textbook about metrology and I literally was like, I still don't feel like I understand anything. Talking to some of the engineers, so I talked to this one guy in particular and he really, really helped set me straight because I was like, hey, could you talk to me about TEV and like all this other stuff and like how does this work? I don't understand how, like, what the heck is a backscattered electron? And he's like explaining these things that are like so obvious to him, but then he just says it, and I'm like, oh, that's exactly what you mean. Like, like it's like, oh, that's how that works. It's like, oh, it's they use heat expansion coefficient to do the acoustics. I was like, duh. Like, but all this stuff is so insane that when you're like reading it, you're like, okay, I understand. Like, I kind of understand what this means, but I really don't understand what this means. And so but the thing is that kind of conversation is very hard. And usually the way that I found the best way to do that is the engineers at the conferences, especially the marketing guys. The marketing guys, their job is communications, right? Versus if you talk to an engineering guy might be the best in the entire world at his process step, but he is working in levels that are so arcane. It's like hard to explain to you without data and models, like because the semiconductor industry is like, it's not image based or like there's no qualitative information anymore. We're past the minds of puny humans. Like it's like all data models and things that like is truly hard to understand. So I think it's like I think there's a lot of value in talking to people, especially when you want to go to that like deep core foundational understanding. But for the most part, I would guess for the people who are listening to this podcast, that's way past the horizon of what you need to know. Like, when I write a primer like that, I truly feel like it's almost useless, if that makes sense. Oftentimes, it's mostly for me. The metrology primer, I just go back and refer to it over and over and over again because I forget. Like, I can't hold that information in my mind. My working memory sucks. So, like, I write this stuff, I learn about it, I kind of forget about it, and then I go back and refer to those primers over time. But like that, so that's like how I think about it on like the day-to-day. Hey, like, getting content out or making like high level strategic stuff about like, any of my longer pieces that are about like industry structure or like stuff like that. I rarely talk to anyone about that. That is just applying common sense to what's going on right now. But if you wanted to do like, if you want to understand the core foundational technology, I think an engineer can really make things really click, but you have to find like the right person in the right space. And that's really rare. There's maybe only, 20 to 100 people who's able to do that. And you'll be really lucky that they live near you, or you can meet up with them in person, or if they like, speak the same language as you. So it's hard. So that's my thought.
The Semiconductor Industry Association, the voice of America's semiconductor industry, is hiring for 2 policy roles. The first is a China-focused job where you'll be managing SIA's China policy and market analysis. This position requires strong Mandarin reading skills. The second will have you managing SIA's export control work, analyzing policy development, coordinating with member companies on a policy agenda, and advocating in front of the federal government. Both positions are looking for candidates with 2 to 7 or more years of experience. For both positions, you'd be right in the vortex of the US-China technology competition. SIA is a really sharp shop, and your boss, Jimmy Goodrich, I can say from many personal interactions over the years, would be a very pleasant person to work for who you would absolutely learn a ton from. Links for both roles are in the description.
John, do you want to talk about Chinese language sources? What you found sort of what your search process is? Are there any particular like that you trust or think are terrible? How do you see this sort of like Chinese language coverage ecosystem?
Mainland, I have no idea. Like mainland, you go in there and you have no idea what you're reading. You're reading something and it's like, can it be right? I don't know. Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe it's pretty iffy. I think the fortunate thing is that I've tried to read several technical papers in Chinese, and it's like a level of Chinese that I've never seen before. Fortunately, a lot of the companies do their presentations in English. Now they're speaking Chinese. Or speaking language is terrible. Like they'll speak in Chinese, but their slides will be in English, and they'll be able to kind of convey basic in English. There's a really interesting article or interesting session that I attended during SemiCon on gallium nitride. It was just fun. And like a number of people there from TSMC and various companies were presenting about gallium nitride, and they spoke the whole thing in Chinese. And, my Chinese is somewhat difficult. It's like I can order some tofu and like that. But, his Chinese, like the Chinese was there. It's like I'm listening to words I do not understand. They're sounds, but they're sounds that seem comprehensive. But and there's like a punchline and everyone laughs. So that's my experience learning Chinese in English. I think what you'll find is that much of the technical papers will be in English. I think the more interesting session is like Japanese. So if you're trying to find technical papers for things that are being done in Japan, a lot of those will be in Japanese. And for that part, Google Translate is sufficient. I think the challenge is more kind of finding those papers and making sure you're searching for the right phrases and stuff like that.
I guess honestly, it's it's English financials or bust, dude. I do Google Translate for some of the Chinese or like Japanese financials, but like at a certain size, if they don't have an English investor relations website, it's pretty much out of my like first level SKU. I will do some stuff if I feel comfortable about like really understanding the company. Like a few of the companies that I maybe walked the floor at SemiCon last year. Also, I want to go to SemiCon East this year. I think I'm going to try to go, and West. We'll see. But of the, like, you know, I start to do research. I like talk to the people. I'm like, oh, I understand what you do now. So it really helps when you like, if you actually understand the ecosystem and you're like, oh, these guys are CMP. They're like they're the number 2 player, but all their financials are in Japanese or something. I don't think it really matters as much because it's like, you know, they do what they do. It's like a dog is a dog. Like the attributes of the step they do and the drivers and all that stuff makes sense. But I guess that would be the time where that doesn't apply, if that makes sense. But for the most part, I think having a really strong industry ecosystem overview and then trying to Google Translate some stuff, and obviously if they have financials at all, I guess, as long as, you know, if you can translate the financials, you can learn a lot about the company. But in terms of like them giving you analysis or insight into like the inventory or the change or like how this business is changing, you're kind of out of luck on that. So that's how I approach it. And then yeah, and oftentimes is if you talk to the competitors of the company, they'll tell you a lot about them as well. So that really helps because everything is context dependent. No one is truly doing anything alone in this industry. So, you know, there's probably an upstream or downstream supplier that understands them really well, that you might be able to have a shot at talking to them in English. So that's usually how I approach it. I have this weird relationship towards what I'm proud of and what does well. I think there's actually an inverse relationship of things that I'm technically proud of, and I think that is a very good like piece of work and how well it does. I think one of the best thing I've ever written, I wrote it in like 2 days. It was super offhanded. I was like, I just got to get this out. You know, everyone knows this. Did amazing. And that's like the tech monopolies go vertical. It's like essentially everything is becoming specialized and the tech companies are going to do it. I'm like, yeah, this is so obvious and so plain to me. This is just like writing something that's so plain for everyone to see. And then I did this like really nuanced piece about like Cloudflare and egress and data center, like east versus west traffic and all this stuff. And some people really appreciate it. Like the small minority was like, dude, this is amazing work. And then like 90% of them are just like, I don't understand what the hell you're saying at all. And I'm like, that sucks, man, because this is something that I'm really proud of. And I think that's actually probably the hardest part about the content creation stuff is knowing your audience and writing towards them or writing for yourself. And I think that writing for and I guess this is a pretty good segue into content creation, but writing for yourself is much more satisfying, sustainable, and I think that like it's more true to you. And I think that in the long run, it accrues back. Like you do pick up some really good true fans, if that makes sense, when you do stuff that you think is like truly good work and people see that, because you're going to do your best work when it's for yourself. But you also can't completely ignore your audience at all, because that's really, you know, like the stuff that, you know, there's times where I'm like, I think this is going to do well. I know it's going to do well because it's the topic du jour. It's really like, you know, it's just on the pulse. It's on the zeitgeist. Like, of course people are going to watch this, versus like the stuff that I'm interested in that's like real research that I feel like is meaningful and like additive, never really does that well. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I had a very weird experience with this a few weeks back. I've been translating stuff on China Talk for 5 years now, and happened to translate Twitter thread, which was on Zeitgeist, It was very sort of used a lot of inflammatory language, and it doubled my Twitter follower count from 20,000 to 40,000. Got me more media attention than I've ever had before in my life. Ton of sort of like government officials reached out to me afterwards. But I just translated something. It wasn't even my analysis. And like it's like I just wrote this like 3,000 word thing on export control of the future of the US-China tech relationship that like I'm really proud of and like spent a lot of time on, lots of nights and weekends, like trying to bang that out, and, gets like 50 likes. And it's a very weird psychological thing as someone who sort of like puts stuff out on the internet, where you sort of know that the things that you're like, you can't really know something is going to go supernova. But I think you can get a sense that I think you do know when like you write a thing that's like a niche thing that it's not going to blow up. And it's frustrating. But I think it's like, it's important sort of mentally to like remind yourself that like, this is why you do this in the first place, is like, don't get like too like, don't like turn into a junkie for like the likes or retweets or subscriber count or whatever. Because like, if you like, the end of that game is like turning into Logan Paul. And it's not what I think any of us or any of the folks who listen to China Talk who may be considering sort of putting their own stuff out on the internet are really trying to get into. The whole point is to put out content that is sort of grounded, thoughtful, and kind of adds to an important conversation of China or technology. Or
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's like unfortunately, the tough thing about YouTube is that like you directly get paid proportionally to how many views you get. So like sometimes you're looking at this and you're like, I'm really proud of this video I did about Taiwan's 7-Elevens from like 1970s onwards, and I found all these great sources. But I know not that many watch this. Not many watch this. But you can have some of that. You can indulge yourself from time to time. But like eventually you gotta like, gotta pay the bills. Yeah.
yeah, so maybe John in this space. I mean, like doing like deep dives into semiconductors is not necessarily what people think about when they first think of YouTube. So, how have you tried to take this, very tricky content and turn it into something hundreds of thousands of people are interested in?
I think it's just like, reflecting on it, I'm like, it's kind of crazy, don't you think? Like, I'm a person that has somehow built an audience on making videos about something that most people never even directly interact with. I mean, they interacted through their devices, but they come in through it in a certain adjacent way. And now that this is something that's in the news a lot, and now you're talking about it all the time. I think the thing about YouTube that I think find most interesting is that a lot of people kind of use YouTube as a way to learn things. And I think I'm really fascinated by a lot of people who come to me, who email me to say, because of you, I watched your videos. I'm really in this, I chose semiconductors as a career. There's a large portion of that, which I think is really fascinating and also terrifying somewhat.
John, I think that's an amazing thing, by the way. Like, I know that like no one can like, I know it's a little terrifying that you're like, hey, I help make someone make a big decision in their life, if it makes sense, and it's kind of like one to many, and you don't really have any kind of stuff like that. But like I do think that a lot of people in the semiconductor industry or adjacent know that it's important, right? Like that's something that like one of the reasons why we keep coming back to it, even though it's this arcane technology that people don't interact with directly, is it's really important. So I think that's really super important that you're helping people make that decision, because we need more technology. We need more talent anyway. Sorry, keep going. I just wanted to tell you that's meaningful.
Oh, yeah. And then there's a portion of people who are elders or 50s or 60s, and they reach out to me saying, hey, John, thanks for this video about, LSI logic. And I really appreciate it. I used to work there in the 80s, and I'm really happy. Thanks for helping me give some context about that. that's also really fulfilling to me. I mean, they're not those people, and I get to ask questions. There's one guy who apparently was like the CFO of some big company, and he's like telling me all these insane stories, which I can't repeat, of like the old 70s and 80s days of being in the semiconductor industry. And I call that cynically nostalgia bait, because that's deliberately designed to work. Like, that's my point. That's part of the YouTube channel. Like, that's what the algorithm has done to me. But like, recognize that, like, at least I know that when some people watch it, they're enjoying something and kind of revisiting a part of their life that they find important. And that's special too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, if you worked in Hollywood, like, you can show your grandchildren the movies you were in, or were the sound, right? It's like very different. When are you going to show your kid like a computer from 1979? Like, it's not going to resonate. But so no, it's very cool, sort of being, especially because this isn't a field that gets a lot of great books, and has a lot of good writing around it. That it's important to sort of be able to sort of memorialize and resurface this stuff, particularly because, as Doug was saying earlier, like, this is how you understand today, is by understanding.
Unfortunately, a lot of these are dead ends. So like the tree of history, I guess, has some ends there, but I mean, at least it's fun. It's a fun story. I think it's great to talk.
I think it's meaningful. It can be really frustrating explaining to people why this matters, if that makes sense. Oftentimes when I explain what I do, I say, like, the chips in your phone. Like, seriously, that's the only way people are like, oh, semiconductors. Like, it takes a little bit of, but at the same time, these semiconductors have truly underpinned a lot of the technological progress over the last 40 years, full stop, right? We are talking to each other through the internet. We're talking to each other through webcams and mics. Those are all, that's a mix of analog and digital. Like, this is all possible because of semiconductors. And like, obviously there's, the things that are built on top of it are a lot easier to understand. It's like, oh, a video conference thing, or, oh, a podcast, or these are distributed, whatever. But at the end of the day, whenever the core foundational magic of it all is that we could make it from, digital to abstracted everything on top of it. And I think that's like something beautiful and profound, in my opinion, and I feel very strongly about that. And it's just like, that's something that I like to tell other people. Like, they're like the core, what we've done with semiconductors and making information available to everyone. It's really core magic. And I think that if people really understood and looked under the covers more, I think people would have that appreciation as well, how special it is. So that's like my, semiconductors are special moment. But I feel very strongly about that. And that's what helps me do my job, at least. Dude, you want to know a really good book about this? Is
Love that moment.
The Information by James Glick. Yeah, dude, he's really good. I like him.
James Glick.
But that book really made me like get more reverent about semiconductors, because they talk about how, like, information theory, how we process information to each other, all this stuff. And then it's like, okay, now let's talk about semiconductors and how it's probably one of like the most like foundational transfers of information, like pure information in our minds, and like, the thought of information into the physical world, right? Like, that is where that special link happens. And yeah, the sand thinking is just like, it's beyond crazy. So I love it. That's what keeps me coming back. So
now that we had that like sort of mystical conversation, I feel bad asking you about like the Substack game, Doug. But thoughts, advice for folks about newsletter writing?
So probably first and foremost, be consistent. I think that's really important. Something that I realized over time is, like, in the past, how I viewed myself was a buy-side analyst. I am some kind of hybrid from there. I would say buy-side analyst, or analyst X writer. And there really is no way to fake the fact that I'm writing every single week. And I think that's really important. The more content you consistently put out, the better you get. So writing more is always better. Try to have a schedule. And then don't let good be the enemy of perfect, or perfect be the enemy of good, rather. Sorry. That's really what I think about. And I try to do a mix of things that I know that are going to be on topic, if that makes sense, like talking about the U.S. export controls. But I also personally very much think that my best work, wherever that is almost always following my North Star and what gets me interested in things. So I just try to write for myself, think about my Substack as writing for me, or perceiving, because I used to be a buy-side analyst. So I just try to think about what I would do to write towards me in the past that I would find interesting, useful, and value added. So that's how I think about it. I don't think that that's the perfect answer. There's actually, if I've learned anything about the Substack game and talking to a lot of other Substackers, there's a lot of ways to cut this cake, man. Like there's many different business models, different business styles. Like, Liberty and my friend Kyler are doing tip-based Substacks, essentially, where it's completely free. So it disseminates as much as can. And it's literally like, hey, do you support this? Or China Talk, for example. Actually, China Talk was, was one of my first tip-based subscriptions. So, and then on the other hand, there's some people doing completely behind paywall, super high value research, crazy high ASPs. There's works for you. I think that like at least my writing style or voice is definitely telling someone something cool at a bar, maybe slightly tipsy. That to me is like, that is definitely like the vibe I'm going for, and I feel like it's the most explanatory I can be and the most receptive. I think that's probably the right voice, right? Like, because you don't want to be like, I don't think anything super academic does really well on the internet. It should be like a casual conversation where you're trying to teach anyone who's just sitting there or something about something. So I think that's definitely the tone I go for. Closing thoughts, I don't really know, man. Semiconductors are cool. I got a lot of work to do. I'm excited for John's work. I'm excited for Jordan's work. It's a cool time to be following the industry, that's for sure. So that's my closing thoughts.
Chip song. You can get another shot at it. Doug, John, what do you got for me?
Oh, Chip song? Dude, oh my gosh, this again? I don't have any... Dude, I feel like we're going to have to, make a bad Fiverr video or something like this to sate your Chip song.
Thanks so much for being a part of China Talk, Doug and John. This is a real treat.
This was a triumph. I'm making a note here. Huge success. It's hard to overstate my satisfaction. Aperture science. We do what we must because we can. For the good of all of us, except the ones who are dead. But there's no sense crying over every mistake. You just keep on trying till you run out of cake. And the science gets done and you make a neat gun for the people who are still alive. I'm not even angry. I'm being so sincere right now. Even though you broke my heart and killed me and tore me to pieces and threw every piece into a fire. As they burned, it hurt because I was so happy for you. Now these points of data make a beautiful line, and we're out of data, we're releasing on time. So I'm glad I got burned. Think of all the things we learned for the people who are still alive. Go ahead and leave me. I think I prefer to stay inside. Maybe you'll find someone else to help you. Maybe Black Mesa. That was a